Hello everyone, we have come to episode 22 of the Battle of, I don't want to brag, so I'm just not going to say it, 7 Years' War. This is the final House of History video about Prussia and Frederick the Great. I'm going to guess, maybe they're working on more, but then again, the hell do I know, because I hate this chair, that popping sound is annoying me. So, let's get into it and see what happens. I gotta sneeze.
On the early morning of August 12, 1759, Russian General Pyotr Saltykov and Austrian Field Marshal Ernst von Loudon discussed what had to be done. They knew the Prussian army was close to their position. They also knew they significantly outnumbered their enemy. But they did not know to their north, Prussian King Frederick the Great and his entire army had spent the night trekking through the wetlands and woods. As dawn arrived, the army finished deploying along their flank and prepared to launch a devastating attack. Lords and ladies stood at the forefront of history written. These titles certainly Frederick the Great spent the winter months of 1758-59 in Breslau. He augmented his battered army with fresh recruits with considerable success, and he managed to field over 160,000 soldiers by the beginning of spring next year, a number comparable to the previous years. But the quality of these soldiers was another matter. Many of the weathered veterans were exhausted, injured, or dead. No expense was spared to improve the artillery to compensate for the lacking infantry. By the start of the campaign, the Prussian army fielded nearly triple the heavy guns it had at the outbreak of war. Frederick was described as having aged a very good deal recently. His clothes were unkempt. He suffered a severe influenza-type fever and took pride in wearing his patchy clothes. He sought comfort in literature, philosophy, poetry and history, composing a study on Charles XII. Frederick's brother-in-law Ferdinand of Brunswick dealt with the French on the Western Front. After they launched an ambitious, aggressive and energetic campaign to recapture Hanover, Ferdinand beat them at the Battle of Minden. This victory made Frederick consider the Western Front nothing more than a far-away theater of war. He concentrated his army around his kingdom's heartland, and rightfully so. He set up his headquarters at Landeshut. In the 57 and 58 campaigns, Frederick beat the Russians, Austrians, Imperials and Swedes one by one. A potential convergence of their forces from 4 different directions would be disastrous. Nearby Leipzig, a 35,000-strong Austrian imperial army under Prince Friedrich of Zweibrücken stood ready to invade Saxony. In Bohemia to his south, Field Marshal Daun and the enormous main Austrian army, at least 100,000 strong, wanted to invade Silesia. The Swedes held themselves up in Stralsund, intending to attack against Brandenburg from the north. To the east, the Russian Cossack vanguard contingent marauding the countryside was only a taste of what was to come. Frederick decided to strike first, whereas Ferdinand started the campaign in the west. Prince Henry did so on the Saxon front. In early April, his 30,000-strong army launched an energetic incursion against Bohemia, raiding supply depots, before turning west into Franconia. Here, Henry levied recruits, collected supplies, and heavily impacted the Imperial Army's mobilization. No major battle took place, but the enemy's logistics suffered. The main Prussian army, some 50,000 soldiers, moved to Breslau to respond to any incursions. Around Troppau in Silesia, General Heinrich de la Motte-Fouquet and 13,000 soldiers raided Austrian supply depots, but the Austrians remained dormant. In fact, it wasn't the Austrians, but the Russians who ignited the campaign of 59 in the east. The Russians had a new commander, Prince Saltykov. He was one of the Tsarina's favorites. During spring, the 61-year-old commander collected his army around Posen. On June 25th, his 70,000-strong army departed, marching downstream the Oder. All that remained between him and Berlin was Donau's 23,000 strong force, just like at Zorndorf the year before. The Prussians were heavily outnumbered. News reached Frederick of Saltykov's march, his supposed inexperience, and the poor condition of the Russian army. He also learned Donau wasn't doing anything to stop them. He berated him for moving like a tortoise. He removed him from command, replacing him with General Karl Heinrich von Wedel. He set out with an army numbering no more than 28,000 to intercept the Russians. But simultaneously Daun began moving, sluggish, as always, creeping towards his southern flank. Things were not looking good, although Daun fortified his camps, and even Austrian records scolded him for how slow he advanced. Saltykov did not have a reputation as a brave or enterprising commander. Because of that, what happened next surprised everyone in the Prussian camp. He outmaneuvered Wedel, whose blind aggression certainly did not help. The armies met nearby Kai, and Saltykov swiftly defeated Wedel, inflicting over 8,000 casualties. A few days later, Saltykov occupied Frankfurt an der Oder. This meant Berlin was only 80 kilometers away and under direct threat. For Frederick, this moment was do or die in the phrase's most literal sense. He tasked Henry with the impossible: hold back Daun's enormous army with no more than 40,000 soldiers. De Montfouquet held the Silesian border with 20,000 troops. Frederick took the remainder of his army to link up with Wedel's survivors and confront Saltykov. The Austrians learned of Saltykov's advance. Daun, cautious as ever.
Every time he says Saltykov, I think if you change that V to a C or a K, and you got Salty Cock on the trail, that's a name that is hilarious and could strike fear in the anus of every opponent.
Was in an ideal position. He had enough troops to march against Henry or Fouquet and send forces to augment Saltykov's army. He sent Loudon and Hadik with a 40,000 strong detachment to the Russians. Loudon reached Saltykov on August 2nd. The losses Saltykov suffered against Wedel were well compensated. Hadik's baggage train was ambushed, prompting him to turn around. A week later, Saltykov took the strong defensive heights nearby the small village of Kunersdorf. Frederick took a route similar to the one preceding the Battle of Zorndorf the year before. On August 6, he linked up with Wedel's battered army. They embarked on their march to confront the enemy. Saltykov's army camped at Kunersdorf for several days. He commanded between 65 and 79,000 troops, 4,600 Cossacks, infantry, cavalry, and 250 pieces of heavy artillery. Their deployment stretched in two lines from the Mühlberg to Kunersdorf south. Loudon's force, some 19,000 troops, closed the left flank. Prince Golitsyn commanded 5 large regiments and artillery on the Mühlberg. The Russian artillery was positioned on the Mühlberg, Spitzberg, and in concealed pits. Heavily outnumbered, Frederick felt the pressure to take the initiative. His scouts informed him Saltykov was deployed along a long ridge running southwest from Kunersdorf. The Prussian army numbered around 48,000 troops, 53 battalions of infantry, 59 cavalry squadrons, and 140 pieces of heavy artillery. On the evening of August 10, the Prussian army moved from Frankfurt. A pontoon bridge secured the crossing of the river. The Prussian army approached from the north, infantry in the front, cavalry to the rear. They had to cross wetlands and ponds to get to the Russians, but to avoid this, Frederick planned a march to the east, then turning south before turning west. The weather was sweltering. A strong corps under General Fink remained to the northwest, a diversion to keep the Russians occupied.
Frederick Fink von Finkenstein. Frederick Fink von Finkenstein. That is quite the name. All right. There's a load of names I'm loving so far.
As Frederick launched the actual attack from the east. At dawn, Frederick emerged from the woods and finally saw the battlefield and Russian deployment. He realized he made two enormous calculation errors. First, if he were to attack from their east, the Russians would be in a solid position to repel his army. What he initially thought was the Russian rear was the Russian front. Secondly, elevations, marshes, and ponds defended this front line. So Frederick changed his plans. His new objective was to seize the Mühlberg and concentrate the main attack from there. The redeployment was messy and frustratingly slow, heavily impacted by miscommunication and the poor terrain. By 11 AM, the Prussian artillery positioned itself on small elevations around the Mühlberg. Their goal was to repel the Russians, 5 large regiments from the hill, weaken the right flank, and then launch an attack. They opened fire, and a prolonged artillery duel ensued. The artillery duel lasted for an hour. The Prussians had the upper hand. Then 2 lines of 4 battalions each advanced forward against the Mühlberg. The 5 Russian regiments there suffered significant casualties. Saltykov understood the main attack was imminent. He redeployed his army using a small valley beyond the Mühlberg. This so-called Kuhgrund allowed him to concentrate his army with the right flank snugly protected by Kunersdorf and the left by the wetlands and hills. Frederick's misjudgment of the battle terrain and the Russian formations allowed Saltykov to adequately countermaneuver. The Prussians seized the Mühlberg. Suffering around 200 casualties, they pushed back no less than 12,000 soldiers stationed there, seizing 86 guns. Things were looking good.
Wow.
Frederick's generals urged him to take this as a victory and retreat. His army was exhausted, the heat was scorching, but the king pushed on. Frederick ordered his right wing to continue the march against Kunersdorf and ordered Fink's troops to charge and engage the enemy. By the time the artillery took its positions on the Mühlberg, Saltykov's army finished redeployment along the incredibly narrow valley and pasture, the Kuhgrund. Those who fled the Mühlberg now reinforced the main line. To try and give himself more space, Frederick ordered his center and his left to advance through Kunersdorf, all the while exposed to heavy artillery fire. Frederick's generals warned him to stop the attack, but he did not listen. The Prussian left flank advancing towards Kunersdorf ran into several units participating in the North main attack. The barrage of fire and artillery made it nearly impossible to enter the Kuhgrund. Both sides were putting up the most bitter fight on the Kuhgrund, and this part of the field was covered with bodies. Our infantry had been marching through sand on a very hot day. They were tormented by thirst and could scarcely drag themselves along. On our side, it was always the same battalions which went into action, whereas the enemy kept bringing up fresh troops. Confusion set in as more Prussian soldiers entered the cluttered valley. Fink's battalions in the north fought with courage, but the Russian artillery and numerical superiority kept them at bay. Russian artillery was ideally positioned to launch barrages against the Prussians cluttered in the valley. The space was too crowded for any serious cavalry engagement. Sure, there were some scattered, uncoordinated cavalry engagements to the south of the village, but due to the marshes and the ponds, the cavalry was unable to maneuver properly. Frederick ordered Seydlitz's dragoons and hussars to launch a charge to the west of the Kuhgrund. The combined Russo-Austrian dragoon counterattack sent them running. Their retreat allowed the enemy to circle behind the Prussian front lines. Any exhausted infantry sheltering against the Russian artillery now suffered a cavalry charge from the west. A counterattack by Seydlitz pushed them away, but artillery fire prevented him from following up his victory. 3 subsequent cavalry commanders, including Seydlitz, were wounded as the day progressed. General Puttkamer, one of Frederick's favorites, was slain. A final cavalry charge against the Großer Spitzberg led to the Prussian cavalry being subject to an enormous artillery and musket barrage. Loudon, commanding the Cossacks and Austrian cavalry, followed this up with a fierce charge. Russian cavalry deteriorated and squadrons scattered. The infantry was in a miserable state. The close-quarter combat and the constant barrages of fire caused mounting casualties. Saltykov kept feeding his battered army reinforcements. Finally, when they saw their cavalry flee, pursued by the Austrian cavalry, it was enough. to break even the most disciplined soldier. An advance of the Russian infantry on the right flank and the Cossack regiments mowing down fleeing infantry cemented the defeat. Frederick desperately tried to rally his force, but to no avail. The Prussian retreat was anything but orderly. By the end of the day, there were no more than 3,000 surviving soldiers, who somewhat resembled a battle formation. The rest of his army scattered. The king retreated across the river, and throughout the night he heard shrieks of his soldiers slaughtered by roaming Cossacks. Prussia suffered over 6,000 dead soldiers and 11,000 wounded.
Wow.
Around 1,400 were taken prisoner, resulting in over 19,000 total casualties. That is around 40% of its entire force. He lost most guns, about 172, and 28 flags and standards. The Russians lost 14,000 men. About 2,600 were killed, 700 missing, and 11,000 wounded. The Austrians lost 500 killed, 1,500 wounded, and no more than 500 missing. The Prussians lost the battle, not for a lack of courage. Frederick himself was shot several times and had the musket ball holes in his coat to prove it. 2 horses had been shot from under him, and multiple times Zieten's hussars narrowly saved him as Russian Cossacks charged against the king's entourage. Blenheim states Frederick was more liable to a charge of reckless courage than cowardice. He describes Kunersdorf as Frederick's greatest military disaster. Objectively, it certainly was the worst defeat of the Prussian army in 3 years of warfare. Frederick considered the defeat to be in part caused by chance. Historians attribute the defeat to faulty intelligence and inadequate reconnaissance. Kunersdorf was a nail in the Prussian coffin. With a severely crushed and heavily battered Prussian army, there was nothing stopping General Soltykov from linking up with Daun and marching onto Berlin. Nothing could stop the complete, utter destruction of the Kingdom of Prussia. Or was there yet hope? Thank you so much for watching this video.
I got a feeling there's still more to come, so they might still be making these videos, which as soon as I see a new one, I'll jump into it. Sorry, I got something in my eye. I don't know. Alright. Enough of this horse cocky. Oh, don't want to crush those. Those is my... That wasn't me. Alright. Like and subscribe. I'm going to end it here. If they come up with another video and somebody finds out before I do, let me know. And I will jump into it. But until next time, just know that we all love each other. And it's important in these times for us to remember that. And